Hello and welcome to our 2026 Scotland and Wales election analysis, a joint podcast by the Fraser-Valley Institute at the University of Strathclyde and the Welsh Government Centre at Cardiff University, and supported by the Nuffield Foundation. My name is João Sousa, and I am a Deputy Director at the Fraser-Valley Institute, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Ed Poole and Guto Ifan, both from the Welsh Government Centre. And we're going to be talking today about the financing of the Welsh Government. So in our last episode, we talked about the main priorities, but we thought we'd delve a little deeper into what's really going on with funding for the Welsh Government, some discussion about relative spending in Wales, and then how can we tell, or why we can't tell, where the Welsh Government is spending its money. But I'll come to you first, Guto. Tell me about the funding landscape for the last few years, because it has been a tumultuous few years in terms of financing the Welsh Government.
It's driven by what the UK government decides to spend on comparable public services in England. So the Welsh Government, about 80% of its budget still comes from block grants from the UK government. And that the changes from year to year determined by the Barnett formula, which I know that you've done a previous podcast on.
It's our favorite topic in the office. But can you explain in 10 seconds, 15 seconds if you have to, what it tries to achieve?
You essentially get what you got last year plus a change, which is often termed a consequential, and that consequential is determined by the funding formula, by the Barnett formula, and you get sort of a population-based share slightly above for Wales. We've got a needs-based element, an extra 5%, because apparently we've got higher levels of needs than in England. But it's sort of driven by what's spent in England. We get a population share of the changes in spending from year to year, which is sort of interesting and varied implications for debates, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit later on. But yeah, that sort of uncertainty comes from the fact that the UK government has been, over recent years, been changing course, consistently announcing big in-year changes in consequentials, more funding for sort of public sector pay deals in England, for example, which means that the Welsh Government sets its final budget at just before the start of the next financial year, but the supplementary budgets that they produce in year now have just been sort of massive allocations to different spending priorities, and that's made it quite difficult to sort of track those over time.
And we've had just an example of this, haven't we, just now, because the special educational needs and disabilities budget in England has been topped up, or it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. And I think we won't bore our listeners with all the details as to how this has been arrived at, partly because it's speculation and we need to wait for the block grant transparency spreadsheet for that to be fully clear. But essentially the Welsh Government, I think, or the Senedd passed the budget, and so did the Scottish Parliament, before there were then consequentials that do affect this coming year. So there's more spending power for devolved governments for 26-27 than was known at the time of the passage of the budget, which, given that the financial year starts in just a few days, it's not exactly an ideal way of conducting budget planning.
And it's significant. It's about £300 million. That's quite a big increase in the spending power of the Welsh Government. I think it's going to create interesting questions for the next Welsh Government immediately. Yeah, again, we go into this in our report. Spending next year on health is actually set to fall in real terms. So even though that we've got more funding available from additional learning needs spending in England, as a result of that spending in England, I think there's going to be a big call to put that into, at least a big share of it, into healthcare next year. And that's because the Welsh Government has sort of increased health spending this year in 25-26 by a lot. They've sort of cleared out the Wales Reserve and put it all, an extra £200 million, £300 million for in-year and waiting list pressures in the NHS. And that means that this sort of final budget total for next year on the health is actually going to be lower than what's actually spent on health this year. That's going to create a big problem for the next Welsh Government if they come in and all of a sudden they're going to reduce the amount of spending on the NHS if they don't allocate some of that additional funding towards healthcare. So I think that's going to be something interesting to look out for during the first few months of the next administration.
And the reason they can do that is because even though this money comes from spending on education, they don't actually mandate it in any way to spend it on the same areas, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of non-hypothecated. It's sort of not earmarked to anything in particular. The Welsh Government does have full control over its own budget to spend on areas that it wants to. The differences between day-to-day spending and capital spending. But it's one of the advantages of the current system is that the Welsh Government does have full control over how it spends money.
And I'm going to now mention something that we have every time that we get a press release from the Treasury, and I'm sure you guys do too, because I think it comes from the same team. But apparently, Wales has been receiving the largest ever budget settlement consecutively, which is surprising, or is it?
It's very surprising because it's this is now we hear pretty much all the time at the moment about the Welsh Government's now largest ever budget settlement. But given that inflation goes up, it's not that surprising that you'd have a larger number as being your budget total. In fact, we've seen that there hasn't really been a step change in the path of the Welsh budget. So just to give you some figures, just to show you this. The projected increase in the block grant for day-to-day spending is set to increase by an average of 1.9% in real terms over the current parliamentary term, the Westminster term, so between 2023 and 2029. But that is comparing with 2.7% average annual growth during the previous parliamentary term, so the 2019-20 to 2023-24 budget years. So it's just, there's no evidence that this is a massive step change increase for the budget. It has gone up, but then that in itself is not surprising.
This always reminds me of whenever the public sector finances release comes and they're like, the biggest budget surplus in January. It's like, of course it is. It's going to be pretty much every year because, as you said, inflation. But also, we then don't compare it with GDP, for example, which if we did, that might tell us something different because that's kind of measuring the relative affordability of spending, and we're just not.
Absolutely. And this is just a real challenge that we get that particularly that depends on the kind of political interpretation. So, during a period in which there's two different parties in government at Cardiff or Edinburgh and in London, they might say something different about the UK government's allocations than would be the case when they're of the same party. So it's very much in the eye of the beholder on issues like this.
There's been a big sort of emphasis by the Welsh Government on the benefits of having two strong Labour governments either end of the M4. It's been it was a slogan during the campaign in 2024. There was a big increase in spending after that election. So at the first budget that Rachel Reeves presented in autumn of 2024 did increase the size of the Welsh Government budget substantially, but that's relative to what was planned previously by the UK government from March 2024, what was sort of implicitly sort of assumed in both parties, main parties at the time, their manifestos. So there has been an increase compared to those plans, but as Ed alluded to, there hasn't been a big step change in the size of the Welsh budget. And to be honest, those spending plans past 2024-25 were sort of simply not deliverable, really, and they were quite unrealistic. So they were always inevitably going to be sort of topped up, regardless of the party that won the general election. But I think it does create interesting political questions. So Labour sort of put a lot of emphasis on the fact that Labour ended austerity. But if you actually look at the chart, you could arguably say that austerity sort of bottomed out in 2018-19. Yeah. It was after that we started to see budgets growing again, and by 2020 I think you could say that we were receiving the largest ever annual settlement every year because we were above 2010 levels by that time.
Yeah, it was essentially the Philip Hammond chancellorship that changed the spending trajectory, really. I mean, you can argue about like particular accelerations and decelerations and plans over time, but ultimately there was 6 or 7 years of pretty tight settlements, and then particularly on health, the big thing that happened was the birthday present to the NHS, I think the 70th anniversary, that Prime Minister Theresa May announced, and that was the start of the ramping up on health spending.
Yeah, and it just points, all of this points to the issue that we just raised at the start of this episode about how difficult it is for any Welsh government and Scottish government to be able to plan for the kind of the way in which successive chancellors of both colours have managed the out years. So we've got multiple chancellors now putting quite large increases, annual increases in the first couple of years, which are then paid for by much smaller rates of growth in the out years of the forecast into that kind of 5-year plan. And in most cases, those out year forecasts are just undeliverable. So we get these injections of cash then coming hard on their heels. So we're getting this very, very difficult shape of how any devolved government is able to manage its out years, because it's got to kind of, it's almost like a poker game where you're just expecting that the out year forecasts are going to be topped up, but you have no actual knowledge of that. So it's just a very, very difficult state of affairs to manage.
Yeah, and it creates like really poor incentives as well, because it creates this situation where you have to spend money now, and you're almost kind of daring the Treasury to say, you know, you can't be serious about the numbers you've put out.
Exactly.
But you're doing it with people's jobs and with public services. So if someone were to call that bluff, then that could have really disastrous consequences.
And in what we're doing at the moment, of course, both in Wales and in Scotland on this project, is we're looking at manifestos and the sustainability of the party's promises. And that's a lot harder than it should be, because we don't know whether a certain pledge is going to be affordable or not, because we can't be sure that the out year forecasts themselves are accurate. So it's a real challenge for any voters or organisations looking at what's affordable and what's not in terms of the pledges that parties will make going into this election.
Yeah, it's a pretty difficult set of circumstances and context to do anything about. What we can talk about now, I think, is something that caught my eye for, when reading the executive summary and the press release that you guys put out with your report earlier in the month. And it was to do with relative spending in Wales versus the rest of the UK, or England in this particular comparison, I think it was. You were saying that the relative spending in Wales is actually lower than something that the Treasury has calculated before. And so can you just explain to me and to our listeners why it's different and why there are multiple numbers?
Yeah, this is the most highly charged political question when it comes to the fiscal policy of the Welsh Government in Wales. There's a long-standing debate over whether the Barnett formula is fair or not in Wales. It's a very different debate in Scotland, where, of course, famously back in 2014, the famous vow pledged to continue the Barnett mechanism for the funding of the resources that would come from the block grant in Scotland. There's been a long-standing view in Wales historically that the Barnett formula underfunds Wales on the basis of need. However, more recently, there's been some evidence that situation has turned around, and instead of squeezing down towards England's levels, even though Wales has greater needs because of greater levels of ill health, greater levels of poverty and deprivation, and so on and so forth. Even though we'd been squeezing down towards England's level of 100% or exactly the same level of spending per person, there's now evidence, certainly in the methodologies that have been worked on by the Treasury and the Welsh Government, that our relative advantages increased again. And this kind of came to a head a couple of weeks ago when, using a well-established methodology that has been agreed to by the Welsh Government a decade ago, the IFS reran the numbers, if you like, and it looked like there would be relative funding for the Welsh Government of about 125% of England's level per head in 2024-2025. Now, that's really important, because if that were accurate, if the methodology were accurate, then we'd expect about 4.7 billion more is available to the Welsh Government than a straight population share of English comparable spending. And therefore, it raises correspondingly challenging questions about the outcomes that are being delivered in Wales, given that higher level of investment. But when you look at, and again, this is from a methodology that looks at the kind of comparability factors in the Barnett formula and comes up with an estimate.
Those comparability factors, so basically the way the Barnett formula works, and we'll delve into a little bit more detail because we have to. So for each kind of program level, there's a comparability factor. Is like, is it devolved or is it not? And then that gets aggregated at departmental level for these comparability factors. So for example, for health, it's pretty much 100. I think it's just short of 100 because there's some things that are done in England that specialist services, but then education, for example, that's 100%. But then there are other areas where it's much lower. So for example, just to see the difference between Wales and Scotland in regards of that, you have something like the court system, which is run by the Ministry of Justice for England and Wales, whereas Scotland's got the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, which is fully devolved. So there's differences in the level of devolution. It's what we call asymmetric devolution in the United Kingdom, and it's been a feature of devolution throughout its existence. At whatever level, there have been differences across countries.
And the issue that we have is that there's no specifically English budget that you can directly compare the English block grant with the Welsh block grant. So that has to be estimated. Mm-hmm. And the way that they estimated it using those comparability factors, you can take almost all of the Department for Education, for example, because that's going to be devolved. So you add that in, you put 100%, you apply that comparability factor, 100% of healthcare, for example, in England, and then start to build a picture of what comparable spending in England. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of technical adjustments for sort of devolved taxes for non-domestic rates, so business rates in England, what's retained or not by local authorities. But yeah, using that methodology, and as I mentioned, which was agreed by the Welsh Government as part of the Fiscal Framework Agreement in 2016, you get to about 125% in 24-25, in 2024-25 for that latest outturn data year that we've got. And then actually devolved taxes in Wales has been, even though we haven't changed tax rates, the income tax rates, the Welsh Government has actually benefited from a faster growth in the tax base. And if you add in devolved borrowing on top of that, suggests that funding is about 27% higher than England's level per person. However, something interesting or something strange going on in that methodology of we've seen spending ramping up over that sort of post-pandemic period, but that would usually imply that we'd see convergence because of the Barnett squeeze effect down to England's level. But what we've actually seen is a divergence of effect. So going from 120% to 125% through the block grant. So that's not something that we would have expected in the mechanics of how the Barnett formula works. And actually, what we do in the report is, okay, if we are receiving this 25% or 27% more per person, how does that translate into actual spending, outturn spending? And we can look at the Treasury's data then, and country and regional analysis data. We know, for example, that health spending, which we can easily compare between England and Wales, is about 9% higher in Wales, or 4% once you adjust for Wales as sort of using an age-adjusted measure. We know that spending on education is about 7% higher. Spending on social services in particular and other local government spending is a lot higher per person, so about 30 to 40% higher in Wales. But then if you add in those sort of largely devolved areas that we know that we can broadly compare Wales with England, it's not perfect, we get to a figure on those services, on the mostly devolved services, of about 115% of England's level. Now, there's a couple of things that might push that up a bit. So, for example, council tax levels is going to be roughly the same per person. So it's not directly comparing apples with apples. There are different ways of looking at this question of comparing relative spending, different ways of it covers, and it's based on different sort of accounting measures, etc. But it does suggest that benefit that we get from on the funding methodology, that methodology that we talked about at the start, doesn't translate into such a big difference in actual spending levels. As Ed said at the beginning, that has a big implication then of how do we sort of assess how the Welsh Government is using its budget, and the outcomes that it's generating. I think there's really valid criticisms that you can make, and the IFS report, their second report that they put out a couple of weeks ago, goes into real good detail on sort of the shortcomings of public services in Wales. Funding does play a part of it on some services in particular. For example, on healthcare, as I mentioned, spending is about 9% higher per person. If you take into account older age population, deprivation, sparsity, etc., you might actually, the Halton Commission, for example, suggested you need higher levels of spending than that to achieve the same level of outcomes.
Just so, because it's quite a technical detail, what you're saying is that the comparability factors kind of look at UK government budget, but the UK government budget isn't just the English spending, it's also some other spending that isn't directly just England. So when you then look at actual spending on roughly comparable areas of competence, then it looks like the spending levels aren't actually as far apart as it looks from the comparability factors.
Exactly. It's exactly that. So either the levels of imputed English spending are too low, or they're too high for Wales. We don't know which one it is,
right,
but that is creating a large gap. And this is really important, right? Not only for political reasons, because if there's almost 5 billion extra than a population share would be deserved, and it does raise real questions about the quality of public services in Wales, but also those of you who know your fiscal frameworks in Wales and Scotland, the fiscal framework for Wales, one of the big wins in the negotiation for that, for the Welsh Government, was on top of everything in the Barnett formula, there would be a 5% additional increase, which would be called the needs-based factor. It wasn't calculated, it's simply a number of 5% that's added to the Barnett formula, just to try and stop Wales's relative levels of spending converging back down to those in England. But actually in the fiscal framework agreement, if Wales drops below 115% of English funding, then the needs-based factor increases from a 5% multiplier to a 15% multiplier. So if we are talking that we're actually on the cusp of a turbocharge additional amount of money, but in the official Treasury methodologies, we're way away from that happening. So it actually has political consequences, but also very material consequences for the Welsh budget, because we are at 115. We actually should be seeking to have an increase in that needs-based factor, as in the agreement, from 5% to 15%.
I think just one last point on this, like the other context, the key bit of context is that political parties, I think, well, at least a few parties are going to ask for in manifestos, ask for a review of the Barnett formula, and needs-based funding has been sort of a clarion call for sort of Welsh policymakers since the Halton Commission report came out in 2010. That suggested that Wales needed about 115% of England's level to achieve the same level of public service provision. I think what both of these methodologies suggest is that we're not massively underfunding, and moving towards a needs-based estimate, a needs-based system wouldn't necessarily mean that Wales gets more funding. So I think it's a really sort of worthwhile cause, and as sort of political economists and as sort of academics, we'd welcome sort of a across the board pan UK review of funding formulas, and to come to a more rational system. But it wouldn't necessarily mean that Wales would be better off. I don't think it would mean that Wales would necessarily be that much worse off either. I think what both our report and the IFS report sort of stresses that particularly important for Wales is that we need to review the needs-based estimate, the needs estimate, which came out in 2010. Some of that data was based on 2001 census data. So you're talking about almost 3 decades old assessments of relative needs. So that obviously should be a part of the conversations of updating this sort of arcane funding system that we have in the UK.
Not sure the Scottish government of whatever colour would necessarily agree to a multilateral review of the Barnett formula, but there you go.
Well, I think you've just touched on something that, for sad as I am, I did go to the National Archives a while ago, and read about how beginning of the Barnett formula in the 1970s, that was already the issue. The Scottish office at the time had no intention of revisiting this and pushed back very strongly, because Scotland starts from a position where it has relatively higher spending. I think there would be some justifications for some higher spending in some cases in Scotland, in some level because of its geography, because Scotland does have a third of the landmass of the UK, and some very, very remote communities that there aren't in any other part of the UK.
And devil's advocate here from the Scottish perspective. I mean, the Scottish taxpayer via particularly North Sea oil and gas, on a per capita basis, Scotland contributed more to the UK tax pot than any other part of the UK, including England, for about 40 years. So there is a historic, not just the kind of very long path dependencies, but there's other arguments that you could use as well.
Yeah.
But,
But there's definitely a kind of the Barnett formula might lead to some convergence over time, but it starts from that higher level of spending, and that comes from a period of time where Scotland was getting very high levels of spending to combat, for example, very poor housing conditions. So that gets baked into the formula. But we have talked a lot about the Barnett formula, and we have now gone over our allocated time. So we are going to call it a day. We'll be returning to this topic, and we'll be discussing a few other things that will be of interest, no doubt. But do join us next time when we're going to be talking about the financing of the Scottish government, and we'll see what some of the challenges are in that regard. But all that's left for me to say right now is thank you to Ed and Guto. Thank you to you for listening, and we'll see you soon.